Egypt, the birthplace of one of the most powerful and enduring civilizations on Earth. From above, the sheer scale of the land is striking, almost 400,000 square miles of desert stretching to every horizon. And yet, here against all odds, the ancient Egyptians built monuments so vast and cities so grand that they still dominate the landscape thousands of years later. How did a people surrounded by harsh desert and searing heat create a civilization that lasted for more than 3 millennia? The River Nile, a lifeline running the length of the country, it transformed barren sand into fertile farmland, allowing great cities and mighty kingdoms to rise from its banks. Without it, there would be no pyramids, no pharaohs, no Egypt. But this story is not only about rivers and monuments. It is about ambition and power, faith and survival. It is about how, generation after generation, the Egyptians endured famine, war, and invasion, yet somehow continued to thrive. This is the epic journey of ancient Egypt. 3,000 years of triumph and legacy that shaped the world we know today. Long before pyramids rose, long before pharaohs ruled, small communities gathered along the Nile. They planted wheat and barley, fished in the river, and raised animals on the grassy floodplains. The Nile provided food, water, and a natural highway. Boats carved from papyrus reeds drifted across its surface, linking scattered villages together. But the Nile was unpredictable. Some years the floods were too small, leaving the crops to wither. Other years the waters came too high, destroying fields and homes. Survival meant learning the rhythms of the river, predicting its moods, and working together to control it. Over time, these small communities realized they needed unity, leadership, and organization. The seeds of Egypt's first kingdoms were being sown. For centuries, the people of Upper and Lower Egypt lived separately, each with its own rulers, traditions, and gods. Upper Egypt's kings wore the tall white crown, while the kings of Lower Egypt wore the red crown. Yet the river tied them together, and eventually, one ambitious leader sought to unite the two lands into a single kingdom. His name was Narmer, known also as Menes in later traditions. Around 3100 BCE, he achieved what no one had before: the unification of Egypt. Archaeologists believe he led armies from Upper Egypt northward, conquering the delta and bringing the two regions under one rule. The story of his victory is carved into the Narmer palette, a stone artifact over 5,000 years old. On one side, Narmer is shown wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt. On the other, he wears the red crown of Lower Egypt. Together they symbolize the birth of a new nation, the first true state in history. From that moment, Egypt would be ruled by pharaohs, kings who were more than men. They were seen as gods on earth, chosen to maintain the sacred balance of order against chaos. The unification marked the dawn of the first dynasty, and with it, the story of ancient Egypt truly began. From the air, the Nile was more than a river. It was the spine of a nation. It carried armies to war, ferried stone blocks for temples, and allowed trade to flow between villages and cities. Egypt's earliest rulers understood this power. They built their capitals close to the river, ensuring that they controlled both the fertile floodplains and the routes of communication. The Nile also gave rise to Egypt's religion. The cycle of flood and renewal was seen as divine, a promise of rebirth written into the landscape itself. To the Egyptians, life and death mirrored the river. Just as the Nile flooded and receded, so too did the human soul pass from this life to the next, only to be renewed again. To govern a kingdom stretching hundreds of miles, the pharaohs needed more than soldiers, they needed record keepers. Out of this necessity came one of Egypt's greatest inventions: writing. Hieroglyphs, pictures carved into stone or painted on papyrus, first appeared around 3100 BCE. At first, they were simple symbols for names and goods, used to record taxes and offerings. But over time they evolved into a complex system capable of capturing prayers, poems, and stories. Writing gave Egypt its voice, a way to preserve its memory across centuries. And with writing came identity. Egypt was no longer a collection of villages along a river. It was a kingdom with laws, culture, and a vision of eternity. The earliest rulers left their mark, not with pyramids, but with tombs made of mud brick and stone. These were not just graves, they were gateways to the afterlife. Egyptians believed that the pharaoh's soul, or Kaya, lived on after death and needed a place to dwell. To feed the soul, offerings of bread, beer, and meat were placed in the tombs. Priests performed rituals to keep the spirits alive. Over time, these practices grew more elaborate. Temples rose beside the tombs, carved with scenes of gods and offerings. Religion was no longer separate from politics. It was the very foundation of the pharaoh's power. By 2700 BCE, Egypt had entered the Old Kingdom, the first great age of pyramid building and centralized power. The groundwork was laid, a united kingdom, divine kingship, a written language, and a belief in eternity. The civilization of Egypt was no longer just surviving, it was preparing to build monuments that would outlast time itself. The unification of Egypt under Nama had created something entirely new in human history, a single kingdom stretching hundreds of miles, ruled by a god-king whose authority reached into every field and village. For the first time, people were not living in scattered tribes or rival cities, but as one nation bound together by faith, politics, and the rhythms of the Nile. Out of this unity came ambition, an ambition so great that it would transform the very landscape of Egypt. It was during the Old Kingdom, beginning around 2700 BCE, that Egypt entered its first golden age. The pharaohs were now absolute rulers, commanding not just armies but laborers, craftsmen, and priests. They controlled the wealth of the Nile Valley, and with it the power to dream on a scale the world had never seen before. Early pharaohs of the first and second dynasties were buried in rectangular mud brick structures known as mastabas. These were simple in design, but they marked a crucial step, the belief that the pharaoh required a permanent home for eternity. The Egyptians had come to see their ruler as a divine being, someone who bridged the human world and the gods. To preserve his spirit after death was to preserve the order of the universe itself. This belief set the stage for one of the most dramatic leaps in architecture, the creation of the Step Pyramid. Around 2660 BCE, Pharaoh Djoser of the Third Dynasty sought something greater than the mastabas of his ancestors. He turned to his chief architect, a man who would later be worshipped as a god himself, Imhotep. Imhotep's vision was radical. Instead of a single tomb, he stacked mastaba upon mastaba, creating a towering staircase of stone that reached toward the heavens. The result was the Step Pyramid of Saqqara, the first monumental building made entirely of stone in human history. Standing nearly 200 feet tall, it was unlike anything the world had seen. Surrounding the pyramid was a vast complex of temples, courtyards, and shrines, an entire city for the afterlife. The Step Pyramid was not merely a tomb, it was a declaration that Egypt had the resources, organization, and vision to reshape the earth itself. The Step Pyramid opened the door to even grander ambitions. Later pharaohs of the Fourth Dynasty would push the limits of engineering, creating the smooth-sided pyramids that became the very symbol of Egypt. Pharaoh Sneferu, a master builder, experimented tirelessly. His first attempt, the bent pyramid, changed angle midway through construction, likely to prevent collapse. His second, the red pyramid, perfected the smooth design. These experiments paved the way for his successor, Khufu, to build the greatest pyramid of all. Around 2580 BCE, Pharaoh Khufu ordered a tomb so immense it would stand as the tallest human-made structure on Earth for nearly 4,000 years, the Great Pyramid of Giza. Constructed from over 2 million limestone blocks, each weighing several tons, it remains a mystery how exactly the Egyptians moved and placed them with such precision. Tens of thousands of laborers, artisans, and specialists worked for decades, supported by an entire infrastructure of bakeries, breweries, workshops, and barracks. This was not the labor of slaves, as once believed, but of skilled workers, organized in teams and rotated seasonally. bound by loyalty to their king and belief in the afterlife. When completed, the Great Pyramid rose 480 feet into the sky, its surface gleaming with polished white limestone that reflected the sun like a beacon. At its heart lay a series of chambers and passages designed to protect Khufu's body and treasures for eternity. Surrounding the pyramid were smaller tombs for queens, nobles, and officials, as well as temples for rituals that would continue long after the king's death. Beside Khufu's pyramid rose those of his son Khafre and grandson Menkaure, together forming the iconic Giza Plateau. Guarding them all was the Great Sphinx, a colossal statue with the body of a lion and the face of a pharaoh, symbolizing the power and divine authority of Egypt's rulers. Why did the Egyptians build such monumental tombs? The answer lies in their vision of the afterlife. For the ancient Egyptians, death was not an end but a transition. The pharaoh's soul, or Kham, would live on, requiring food, offerings, and a secure resting place. To ensure this, tombs had to be indestructible, filled with treasures, and protected by rituals. The pharaoh was not just a king, he was a living god, the embodiment of Horus on earth, and upon death, he joined the sun god Ra in the heavens. Building pyramids was not simply an act of power, it was a sacred duty, ensuring the survival of Egypt itself. Yet the Old Kingdom was not only about kings and pyramids. Beneath the grandeur lay a thriving society. Farmers along the Nile produced abundant crops. Thanks to the predictable floods, surplus harvests supported a growing class of craftsmen who specialized in pottery, jewelry, carpentry, and textiles. Scribes recorded every detail of the kingdom's administration, from grain rations to temple rituals. Art and culture flourished. Wall carvings and statues depicted scenes of daily life, farmers tending fields, fishermen casting nets, musicians playing harps. These were not only decorations, they were believed to come alive in the afterlife, ensuring the deceased could continue enjoying the pleasures of life. Archaeological discoveries at Giza reveal the bustling life of the workers who built the pyramids. Excavations have uncovered bakeries with massive ovens, breweries producing beer, and even medical facilities with evidence of healed bones. These findings paint a picture of a well-fed, well-organized community where thousands labored not under whips, but with purpose and pride. The pyramids, then, were not just royal tombs, they were national projects, symbols of unity, drawing the strength of an entire people toward a single vision of eternity. But such monumental ambition came at a cost. By the end of the 5th and 6th dynasties, the resources required to build pyramids strained the economy. Pharaohs lost some of their authority as local governors, known as nomarchs, grew more powerful. Prolonged droughts weakened the agricultural base, leading to famine and unrest. By around 2180 BCE, the Old Kingdom collapsed, ushering in a period of political fragmentation known as the First Intermediate Period. Egypt was no longer united under a single powerful pharaoh. Rival rulers rose in different regions, and for more than a century, the land of the Nile was divided. And yet, even in decline, the achievements of the Pyramid Age endured. The belief in divine kingship, the rituals of the afterlife, the art and writing systems, all remained. The pyramids themselves stood as eternal reminders of what Egypt had once accomplished, inspiring future generations to rebuild and reclaim the glory of their ancestors. The Old Kingdom had shown the world what human beings could achieve when united by vision and faith. Though it ended in crisis, it left behind a legacy of grandeur that still defines Egypt today, and Egypt's story was far from over. Out of chaos would come renewal, and new dynasties would rise, carrying the civilization forward into its next great age. The fall of the Old Kingdom around 2180 BCE was not the end of Egypt, but the beginning of a new cycle, one that would repeat throughout its long history. For more than a century, the Nile Valley was divided, its people torn between rival rulers. This was the First Intermediate Period, a time of chaos and hardship, when famine and instability tested the resilience of a civilization that had once seemed eternal. Yet Egypt did not vanish. The very traditions that had bound it together, The Nile, the vision of kingship, the promise of the gods, remained alive in the hearts of its people, and from this darkness, Egypt rose again. Around 2050 BCE, a powerful leader from Thebes in Upper Egypt emerged, Mentuhotep II. Through war and diplomacy, he reunified the land, restoring order and bringing the two lands under one crown once more. With him began the Middle Kingdom, a period often remembered as Egypt's classical age. The Middle Kingdom was different from the Old. The pharaohs were still divine, but they ruled with a new awareness of responsibility. The hardships of the first intermediate period had shown that Egypt's survival depended not just on monuments but on good governance. Kings of the Middle Kingdom invested in irrigation projects, canals and fortresses, ensuring stability and prosperity for the whole land. Art and literature flourished. Texts from this era reveal a new depth of introspection, poems about the brevity of life, tales of loyalty and betrayal, wisdom literature offering moral guidance. The Egyptians were beginning to explore not only the grandeur of eternity, but the struggles of the human heart. The Middle Kingdom pharaohs also looked outward. They expanded Egypt's influence into Nubia to the south, rich in gold and valuable trade goods. To the east, they secured trade routes into the Sinai and beyond. Egypt was no longer isolated. It was becoming part of a wider world, but as before, prosperity was fragile. By around 1700 BCE, the centralized power of the pharaohs weakened again. Into this vacuum came outsiders, people known as the Hyksos. The Hyksos were likely from the Levant, bringing with them new technologies such as the horse-drawn chariot and advanced weaponry. Settling in the Nile Delta, they gradually gained control of Lower Egypt, establishing their own kingship. For the first time, Egypt was ruled by foreigners, yet the Egyptians did not accept this quietly. In Upper Egypt, native rulers at Thebes continued to hold power, resisting Hyksos rule. For nearly a century, the land was divided once again, until finally, around 1550 BCE, a Theban prince named Amusos drove the Hyksos out and reunited Egypt. With Amusos began the New Kingdom, Egypt's greatest age of expansion and power. Determined never again to be vulnerable to invasion, the pharaohs transformed Egypt into an empire. Armies marched north into Canaan and Syria, west into Libya, and south into Nubia. The Nile Valley was now the heart of a vast domain, and Egypt became a superpower of the ancient world. Wealth poured in from tribute, trade, and conquest, filling temples with gold and cities with splendor. This was the time of the warrior pharaohs. Men like Thutmose III, who led campaigns across the Levant, earning a reputation as Egypt's Napoleon. Under his rule, Egypt reached its greatest territorial extent, stretching from the Euphrates in the north to the fourth cataract of the Nile in the south. But power was not only in the hands of kings. One of Egypt's most remarkable rulers was a woman, Hatshepsut, ruling in the 15th century BCE. Hatshepsut began as regent for her young stepson Thutmose III, but she seized power in her own right, declaring herself pharaoh. To legitimize her rule, she had herself depicted in statues with a false beard, the traditional symbol of kingship. Hatshepsut's reign was marked not by war but by trade and building. She launched expeditions to the fabled land of Punt, bringing back incense, ivory, and exotic animals. She commissioned magnificent temples, the greatest of which still stands at Deir el-Bahari, a terraced monument carved into the cliffs of Thebes, one of the masterpieces of Egyptian architecture. Her reign proved that Egypt's strength lay not only in conquest, but in diplomacy, economy, and culture. Yet Egypt's stability was once again shaken from within. In the 14th century BCE, Pharaoh Amenhotep IV undertook a radical experiment. He abandoned the traditional gods, declaring that only one deity would be worshipped, the sun disk Aten. Changing his name to Ukhenaten, he built a new capital, Ukhtetun, and filled it with temples to the sun. This religious revolution disrupted the foundations of Egyptian society. Priests of Amun, long powerful and wealthy, resisted his reforms. Art and culture shifted dramatically, showing the royal family in intimate, naturalistic poses rather than the rigid formality of tradition. After Akhenaten's death, his successors, including the boy king Tutankhamun, restored the old gods and abandoned Akhetaten. The Amarna period had lasted less than 2 decades, but its memory lingered as a cautionary tale of how even pharaohs could challenge tradition too far. If Akhenaten had been a heretic, another pharaoh soon restored Egypt's glory, Ramesses II, known as Ramesses the Great. Ruling for 66 years in the 13th century BCE, Ramesses was a builder, a warrior, and a master of propaganda. He fought the famous Battle of Kadesh against the Hittites, one of the largest chariot battles in history. Though the outcome was indecisive, Ramesses proclaimed it as a great victory, immortalizing it in carvings across Egypt. He signed one of the first known peace treaties in history, securing Egypt's borders. He built temples on a colossal scale, including Abu Simbel, where 2 giant seated statues of the pharaoh gaze out over the Nile. His reign left such a mark that later Egyptians called him simply the Great Ancestor. But even as Ramesses celebrated his victories, challenges loomed. Maintaining an empire was costly, draining Egypt's treasury. Climate change and famine strained the economy. Foreign invasions, including raids by mysterious groups known as the Sea Peoples, destabilized the region. By the 11th century BCE, the new kingdom collapsed. Egypt lost its territories abroad and fractured once more. The once mighty pharaohs gave way to weaker rulers, while powerful priests in Thebes often rivaled the crown itself. Over the next centuries, Egypt entered the Third Intermediate Period, a time of division, foreign invasions and decline. Nubians, Assyrians and eventually Persians all ruled Egypt in turn. The age of empire was over. Yet even in decline, the achievements of this period were monumental. The temples of Karnak and Luxor, the tombs of the Valley of the Kings, the colossal statues of Abu Simbel, all were products of the new kingdom, testaments to an age of wealth and power. The names of its pharaohs, Hatshepsut, Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, Ramesses, still echo today. Their reigns were marked by innovation, ambition, and drama, leaving behind stories and monuments that defined Egypt's identity for millennia. Egypt had endured invasions, collapses, and experiments in faith. Each time it rose again, transformed but still eternal. Yet as the first millennium BCE dawned, new powers were rising in the Mediterranean, powers that would eventually overshadow even the land of the pharaohs. For more than 2,000 years, Egypt had stood as one of the great civilizations of the ancient world. It had risen, fallen, and risen again through dynasties and empires, its culture enduring even as kings and gods changed. But by the first millennium BCE, the old order was slipping away. New powers were emerging, and Egypt, once the unchallenged heart of civilization, was becoming a prize for foreign conquerors. By 700 BCE, Egypt was weakened by division. Into this vacuum came conquerors from the south. The kings of Nubia, who had long admired and adopted Egyptian traditions, swept north and established the 25th dynasty. For a time, Egypt's rulers were Nubian pharaohs, blending their own culture with the ancient traditions of the Nile. But Egypt's position made it vulnerable. To the northeast, the Assyrians, ruthless warriors from Mesopotamia, invaded in the 7th century BCE, sacking cities and placing puppet rulers on the throne. Soon after, the Persians absorbed Egypt into their vast empire. Pharaohs were no longer divine kings chosen by the gods, but governors answering to distant emperors. Yet even under foreign rule, Egypt's identity endured. Temples continued to rise along the Nile, priests performed the old rituals, and hieroglyphs still recorded the sacred language of the gods. Egypt adapted, but it had lost control of its destiny. In 332 BCE, a new power swept into Egypt, Alexander the Great. To the Egyptians, weary of Persian domination, Alexander was welcomed as a liberator. He visited the Oracle of Ammon at Siwa, where priests declared him the son of the god. For the rest of his life, Alexander embraced Egypt as part of his empire, founding the city of Alexandria on the Mediterranean coast, a city that would become one of the greatest centers of learning in the ancient world. When Alexander died young, his vast empire fractured. Egypt fell to one of his generals, Ptolemy, who established a new dynasty that would rule for nearly 300 years. The Ptolemies were Macedonian Greeks, but they adopted the traditions of the pharaohs. They built temples in the old style, presented themselves as sons and daughters of the gods, and even learned to speak Egyptian. Yet beneath the surface, Egypt was changing. Greek became the language of the elite. Alexandria grew into a cosmopolitan metropolis, home to the Great Library of Alexandria and the towering Pharaohs Lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Egypt was still powerful, but it was now part of a wider Hellenistic world. By the 1st century BCE, another power loomed: Rome. What had begun as a republic in Italy was becoming an empire that stretched across the Mediterranean. Rome's wealth and military strength dwarfed that of the Ptolemies. Egypt, rich in grain and resources, was both an ally and a target. The Ptolemaic dynasty, weakened by internal strife, intrigue, and rival claimants to the throne, found itself increasingly dependent on Roman support. Pharaohs no longer commanded the loyalty of a united people. Instead, they maneuvered desperately for survival in the shadow of Rome's growing might. And it was in this turbulent age that Egypt's last great ruler emerged, a woman whose name still resonates more than 2,000 years later: Cleopatra. Cleopatra VII was born in 69 BCE into the Ptolemaic dynasty, a family notorious for palace intrigue, assassinations, and power struggles. She was not the first woman to rule Egypt, but she would be the last to do so as pharaoh. Unlike many of her predecessors, Cleopatra embraced both her Greek heritage and her Egyptian role. She was the first of her dynasty to learn the Egyptian language, presenting herself not only as a Greek queen, but as the living embodiment of Isis, the mother goddess of Egypt. Intelligent, ambitious, and multilingual, Cleopatra understood that survival required more than tradition. It required shrewd diplomacy. At just 18 years old, she took the throne alongside her younger brother Ptolemy XIII. But soon, the siblings turned against each other in a civil war. It was at this moment that fate and Rome entered her story. In 48 BCE, Julius Caesar, Rome's most powerful general, arrived in Alexandria during his pursuit of his rival, Pompey. Cleopatra saw an opportunity. According to legend, she had herself smuggled into Caesar's quarters wrapped in a carpet. Whether true or embellished, the tale captured the essence of Cleopatra's audacity and charm. She formed a political and personal alliance with Caesar, securing his support against her brother. With Roman backing, she defeated Ptolemy XIII and restored herself to the throne. For several years, Cleopatra and Caesar were partners. She bore him a son, Caesar, and traveled to Rome, where her presence scandalized the conservative elite. To many Romans, she was not merely a queen but a dangerous symbol, a foreign monarch who had ensnared their leader. When Caesar was assassinated in 44 BCE, Cleopatra's future once again hung in the balance. In the struggle that followed Caesar's death, Rome was divided between his assassins and his loyalists, led by Mark Antony and Octavian, later Augustus. Cleopatra chose her side carefully. She allied with Antony, a man of immense charisma and ambition. Their partnership became legendary. Antony was captivated by Cleopatra's intelligence, wit, and power. Together they dreamed of ruling not only Egypt, but perhaps the entire eastern Mediterranean. Cleopatra bore him 3 children, and together they presented themselves as gods, Antony as Dionysus, Cleopatra as Isis. But in Rome, Octavian painted them as a threat. He portrayed Antony as a traitor bewitched by a foreign queen, and Cleopatra as a dangerous seductress who sought to undermine Rome itself. The stage was set for the final confrontation. In 31 BCE, the fleets of Antony and Cleopatra faced Octavian's forces at Actium, off the coast of Greece. It was a battle that would decide the fate of Egypt, and of the ancient world. The fighting was fierce, but Octavian's fleet gradually gained the upper hand. In the midst of the struggle, Cleopatra's ships broke through and fled. Antony followed, abandoning his men. The battle was lost. Defeated and pursued, Antony and Cleopatra retreated to Alexandria. There in 30 BCE, Octavian's armies closed in. Faced with inevitable capture, Antony fell on his own sword. Cleopatra, refusing to be paraded as a trophy in Rome, chose her own death. According to tradition, she allowed herself to be bitten by an asp, though the true method remains a mystery. With her death, Egypt fell to Rome. Octavian, soon to be Augustus, annexed the land as his personal province. For the first time in 3,000 years, Egypt was no longer ruled by pharaohs. Cleopatra's death marked the end of an age. With her, the line of pharaohs stretching back to Nama was broken. Egypt became Rome's breadbasket, its grain feeding the empire's growing population. Temples continued to be built, but they were now overshadowed by Roman monuments. Hieroglyphs lingered for centuries, but gradually faded, replaced by Greek and Latin. And yet, the legacy of ancient Egypt did not disappear. The pyramids still rose over the desert. The temples of Karnak and Luxor, the Valley of the Kings, and the Sphinx continued to awe travelers. Egypt remained a land of mystery and wonder, its monuments whispering of a past when gods walked among men. Cleopatra became a legend, her life and death retold for centuries as a story of ambition, passion, and tragedy. Rome had conquered Egypt, but Egypt had conquered the imagination of the world. For 3,000 years, Egypt had endured. It had seen famine and plenty, invasions and rebirths, tyrants and visionaries. It had built monuments that defied time, crafted art and literature that still inspire, and shaped ideas of kingship, religion, and the afterlife that echoed far beyond its borders. From Nama's unification to Cleopatra's final stand, Egypt was a civilization that refused to vanish, adapting and enduring until the very end. Even under Rome, its spirit lived on, influencing art, architecture, and religion for centuries to come. Today, when we gaze at the pyramids, the temples, and the silent gaze of the Sphinx, we are reminded of a people who, against all odds, sought to build eternity on earth. Egypt may have fallen, but its legacy remains immortal.